why American men don't want to date American women anymore. And little disclaimer, I do live in the US for the past 7 years. 1. Some American men feel that American women are very entitled. They feel that many American women expect a partner who fit a specific ideal. He has to be smart, attractive, successful, fit. They believe that many American women have unrealistic expectations. They expect their partners to do everything, and they expect their partners to put their needs above their own. 2, because of the rise of radical feminism, there is a loss of femininity among American women, and they even started to adopt some masculine traits. 3, opportunistic behavior. A big percentage of divorces are initiated by women, and usually is because they prioritize their career and personal growth over their family life. And a lot of men also express some frustration because they feel that there is a lack of commitment and loyalty among American women. And that is why a lot of American men are now dating non-American women, because they believe that non-American women tend to prioritize mutual respect, shared values, and commitment.
Something historic is unfolding right in front of us, and most people either do not see it or do not want to admit it. Millions of working age men are quietly stepping away from society, not in protest, not with signs or slogans, but through absence. And that absence is reshaping the world faster than any policy or movement ever could. This is not a temporary trend, and it is not a phase. And by the end of this video, you will understand why there may be no clear path to reverse it. And before we get into this, take a second to like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want to get every video the moment we release it. These conversations matter. And the more people who hear them, the clearer the bigger picture becomes. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth in uncertain times, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. The Academy is linked in the description of this video and walks you through how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly with a focus on long-term survival and independence. So go check that out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can always buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description, which helps keep this channel running and independent. Now let us talk about what is really happening, because the headlines barely scratch the surface. Across multiple developed countries, millions of working age men are leaving the workforce, opting out of traditional relationships, avoiding marriage, and disengaging from social systems that once depended on them. This is not driven by laziness or confusion. It is a rational response to decades of accumulated incentives and disincentives that finally tip the scale. When people say they do not know why men are leaving, what they really mean is that they do not like the answer. For decades, men were told that their value came from what they provided, what they endured, and what they sacrificed. Work longer hours, take on more risk, suppress emotion, and shoulder responsibility quietly. In return, the promise was stability, respect, family, and a place in society. That promise eroded slowly at first, then all at once. As expectations increased, appreciation decreased, and accountability became one-directional. Men noticed, men adapted, men learned. What makes this moment different from previous generational shifts is that the exit is permanent for many. These men are not waiting to be persuaded back. They are not negotiating. They are building lives that require less approval, less validation, and fewer external obligations. When society tells someone repeatedly that they are not needed, eventually that person believes it and reorganizes their life accordingly. The surprise is not that men left. The surprise is that it took this long. There is a financial reality that rarely gets discussed honestly. In most developed economies, men still contribute a disproportionate share of tax revenue through work, infrastructure, labor, logistics, manufacturing, and the technical fields. At the same time, consumer spending patterns rely heavily on that same economic output. When men disengage, tax bases shrink, public systems strain, and consumption slows. This is not ideology, this is arithmetic. When one side of the economic engine steps away, the whole system sputters. And what society underestimated was how adaptable men are when left alone. Once the pressure to perform for external approval disappears, priorities shift. Many men discovered that being alone is not the same as being lonely. Solitude, when chosen, can be peaceful. Expenses drop, stress decreases, time expands. A simpler life, once framed as failure, starts to look like freedom. Minimalism was not adopted as a trend, but as a strategy. There is also a social dimension that cannot be ignored. Public narratives over the last several decades increasingly framed men as problems to be managed rather than contributors to be valued. Language matters. When masculinity is treated as something that must be corrected instead of understood, disengagement becomes a logical outcome. Men did not respond with riots or chaos, they responded with withdrawal. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but silence can also be final. Dating and relationships became another area where incentives collapsed. The cost of participation rose while the perceived rewards became uncertain or inconsistent. Men were told to approach less, speak less, risk less, yet still be confident, generous, and assertive. These contradictions did not create better relationships, they created confusion and risk aversion. When every interaction feels like a potential liability, opting out becomes self preservation rather than bitterness. What replaced those traditional goals was not nihilism, but redirection. Men began investing in personal interests, health, financial independence, hobbies, and friendships that did not revolve around constant performance. Many stopped measuring success through social approval and started measuring it through peace of mind. This shift did not happen overnight. It was learned through trial, error, and repeated disappointment. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this movement is that it is not driven by anger, even if anger was once part of the journey. What remains now is calm. Calm is dangerous for systems that rely on emotional leverage. Calm men are hard to manipulate. Calm men are difficult to shame. Calm men do not rush back into structures that fail them just because those structures suddenly feel the consequences of absence. As more men step away, society finds itself asking a question it avoided for years. How do you bring back people you told were unnecessary? How do you ask for participation after years of dismissal? How do you rebuild trust when the incentives remain unchanged? So far, the responses have ranged from denial to moral pressure, but none address the root cause. You cannot shame people into caring about systems that offered them no protection. What is unfolding now is a form of quiet realignment. Men are choosing observable reality over promises. They are choosing stability over status. They are choosing self preservation over sacrifice without reciprocity. This is not collapse driven by chaos, but by consent being withdrawn. Systems only function when enough people agree to participate. That agreement is no longer guaranteed. As daily life becomes more expensive and more complex, the gap between expectations and rewards becomes harder to ignore. Many men looked at the equation honestly and decided it no longer balanced. That decision was not impulsive, it was calculated, and once made, it rarely gets reversed. The idea that things will simply return to how they were ignores the psychological shift that already occurred. We now see a growing number of voices asking where the men went and why they are not coming back. The uncomfortable truth is that they did exactly what they were told to do. They stepped aside. They focused inward. They stopped volunteering for systems that viewed them as disposable. And in doing so, they discovered something unexpected. Life continued. In many cases, it improved. This is why attempts to lure men back with messaging alone will fail. Without structural change, without restored balance, and without genuine respect, there is no incentive to return. People do not abandon peace once they have found it. They protect it. And that is what we are witnessing now on a massive scale. To understand why this shift feels so unsettling to so many institutions, you have to understand how deeply men were woven into the invisible machinery of society. Men filled the roles that kept systems functioning quietly in the background. They worked jobs that were physically demanding, psychologically draining, and often thankless. They accepted long commutes, dangerous environments, and chronic stress because there was a shared belief that their effort mattered. When that belief eroded, the motivation followed shortly after. What makes this moment unprecedented is that men did not replace one social contract with another. They did not pivot into alternative collective movements or demand new privileges. Instead, they stepped outside the structure entirely. That kind of disengagement is far more destabilizing than open resistance because there is no opposition to negotiate with. There is yet only absence, and systems designed around constant male participation suddenly find themselves underpowered and understaffed. The public conversation still struggles to acknowledge agency in this decision. Many narratives frame men as confused, lost, or manipulated, but those descriptions miss the core reality. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. This was not confusion. This was pattern recognition. Men observed outcomes over time and adjusted behavior accordingly. When effort no longer led to stability, when loyalty no longer led to security, and when compliance no longer led to peace, the rational response was to stop investing. One of the most uncomfortable truths is that many men did exactly what they were advised to do. They worked on themselves. They focused on mental health. They removed negative influences. They simplified their lives. They stopped chasing external validation. When these actions led to measurable improvements in well being, the lesson was reinforced. There was no incentive to return to environments that previously caused stress and dissatisfaction. This is where the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. Society encouraged self care, boundaries, and emotional awareness, assuming those values would funnel men back into existing structures. Instead, those tools gave men the clarity to walk away. Once men learned that they could meet their own needs without constant compromise, the old expectations lost their power. Another element often overlooked is how technology enabled this transition. Remote work, digital entertainment, online learning, and decentralized finance reduced dependence on traditional social pathways. Men no longer needed to be physically present in large social systems to meet their needs. Independence became practical, not theoretical. When autonomy becomes achievable, compliance becomes optional. Financial minimalism played a major role as well. Many men realized they did not need large homes, expensive status symbols, or constant consumption to feel satisfied. Reducing financial obligations reduced vulnerability. With fewer expenses came fewer pressures and fewer reasons to tolerate unfavorable arrangements. Simplicity became a form of security. This shift also exposed how much emotional labor men were expected to absorb without acknowledgement, and men were expected to be resilient, understanding, patient, and supportive while having their own experiences minimized or dismissed. Over time, that imbalance became unsustainable. Walking away was not an act of bitterness, but an act of conservation. As more men opted out, the ripple effects became harder to ignore. Labor shortages emerged in critical sectors. Tax revenues softened. Public services strained under increased demand with fewer contributors. Yet, even as these consequences became visible, The response rarely addressed root causes. Instead, messaging focused on urging men to re engage without altering the conditions that drove them away. There is also a psychological element that deserves attention. Once someone experiences a period of peace after years of stress, returning to chaos feels unnecessary and irrational. Many men discovered hobbies, routines, and personal projects that gave them a sense of purpose without external pressure. This internal validation replaced the need for social approval. The idea that men are suffering in isolation is often projected rather than observed. While some individuals do struggle, many report improved mental health, better sleep, and lower anxiety after disengaging. The assumption that men cannot thrive alone says more about societal expectations than lived reality. Independence does not automatically equal despair. What unsettles institutions most is not that men left, but that they are not asking to return. There are no mass demands, no negotiations, no calls for reform from within. Silence communicates satisfaction more clearly than protest ever could. When people are content, they do not seek validation from the systems they left behind. The dating landscape illustrates this shift clearly. As men disengaged, the imbalance became visible. Expectations did not adjust symmetrically. Instead of mutual recalibration, there was confusion and frustration. The assumption that men would continue participating, regardless of incentives, proved false. Choice replaced obligation. This is not a rejection of connection or companionship as concepts, it is a rejection of asymmetry. Men did not abandon relationships because they disliked connection. They abandoned environments where effort and outcome were consistently misaligned. When costs outweigh benefits long enough, disengagement becomes inevitable. Another factor driving permanence is trust erosion. Trust, once broken repeatedly, does not regenerate through words alone. It requires consistent behavioral change over time. Many men concluded that waiting for such change was an inefficient use of their limited time and energy. They chose certainty over hope. As this realignment continues, new norms are forming quietly. Men are sharing information with each other about finances, health, and lifestyle optimization. Knowledge that once flowed vertically through institutions now flows horizontally through peer networks. This decentralization further weakened traditional leverage points. There is also a generational aspect. Younger men are observing older men who walked away and seem content. They are learning from example rather than instruction. This observational learning accelerates the trend. When opting out appears viable and beneficial, participation becomes optional rather than assumed. Attempts to reframe disengagement as a problem to be solved often miss that it solved a problem for the men who chose it. Re engagement would require reintroducing the very stressors they worked to eliminate. Without compelling incentives, such a move makes little sense. The broader implication is that society can no longer rely on inherited expectations. Participation must now be earned rather than assumed. Systems that adapt may survive. Systems that insist on compliance without reciprocity will continue to lose participants quietly. This moment forces an uncomfortable reckoning with how value is assigned. For years, contribution was demanded while appreciation declined. Responsibility increased while authority diminished. When imbalance becomes normalized, withdrawal becomes corrective. Men did not vanish. They redirected, they invested inward, they recalibrated priorities. And in doing so, they exposed how fragile systems become when they rely on unspoken obligations rather than mutual benefit. The future will likely feature a smaller but more deliberate participation base. Those who engage will do so by choice, not inertia. That alone changes the social equation profoundly. Consent, once withdrawn, is difficult to reclaim without meaningful reform. As we move forward, the question is no longer why men left. The question is whether existing systems are capable of adapting to a reality where participation is optional and autonomy is valued. That answer remains uncertain. This shift is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and ongoing, and that is precisely why it is so powerful. Silence, when chosen, speaks volumes. Another reason this shift feels irreversible is that it is internally reinforced rather than externally driven. Once men step away, and experience improved quality of life, the decision validates itself. Stress decreases, financial strain eases, and personal time expands. This creates a feedback loop where disengagement becomes associated with relief rather than loss. That psychological reinforcement is powerful, and it does not require ideology to sustain it. It requires only lived experience. Many people assume that social participation is a default human need, but that assumption ignores context. Humans seek meaning, stability, and agency. When traditional systems fail to provide those things, people adapt by building smaller, more controllable environments. For many men, that environment became a simplified life centered around autonomy. Meaning did not disappear, it relocated. What often goes unspoken is how much energy was spent navigating uncertainty. Unclear rules, shifting expectations, and inconsistent outcomes drain motivation faster than hard work ever could. Men are generally problem solvers. When the problem becomes unsolvable, disengagement becomes the solution. This was not an emotional reaction, it was a strategic one. The idea that men would indefinitely tolerate the disadvantage because of tradition or habit underestimated how quickly habits dissolve when incentives change. Loyalty is not infinite, it depends on trust, predictability, and mutual respect. Remove those, and loyalty becomes self harm. Men recognized that line and stepped back before crossing it. There's also a misunderstanding about ambition. Many men did not lose ambition, they redirected it. Instead of climbing social ladders that offered diminishing returns, they focused on personal mastery, financial resilience, and private fulfillment. Ambition without recognition can still exist. It simply no longer feeds public systems. This redirection exposed how much identity had been outsourced to external validation. Once men reclaimed authorship over their own lives, the need for approval declined sharply. That shift alone undermined many mechanisms that relied on shame, praise, or pressure to enforce participation. When validation becomes internal, manipulation loses effectiveness. Another overlooked factor is how conflict avoidance played a role. Many men did not leave because they wanted confrontation. They left because they wanted peace. Withdrawal was the least disruptive option. It avoided arguments, legal risk, reputational harm, and emotional exhaustion. In that sense, opting out was a form of harm reduction. As men withdrew, a strange paradox emerged. The very behaviors men were criticized for not performing were the behaviors now being requested. Participation, provision, engagement, and responsibility were suddenly missed once absent. This reversal highlighted how dependent systems had been on assumed male involvement while simultaneously discouraging it culturally. The problem with attempting to reverse this trend is that it requires rebuilding credibility. Credibility cannot be restored through messaging alone. It requires consistent action over time. Men who have already restructured their lives are unlikely to gamble stability on promises. They require proof, not intention. Like this creates a time mismatch. Systems need immediate participation. Men demand long term reliability. That mismatch stalls reconciliation. While institutions operate on urgency, individuals operate on caution. Until those timelines align, disengagement persists. Another element shaping permanence is adaptability. Men who walked away learned new skills, adjusted expectations, and created routines that do not rely on external permission. Once adaptability increases, dependency decreases. Dependency is what makes people vulnerable to pressure. Reduced dependency increases negotiating power, even when no negotiation is sought. There is also a moral clarity that emerges when noise is removed. Without constant social pressure, men reassessed what they actually wanted rather than what they were told to want. That reassessment led many to conclude that peace outweighed status and simplicity outweighed recognition. These conclusions are hard to undo once internalized. Critics often frame this movement as avoidance, but avoidance implies fear. What we see instead is selectivity. Men are choosing where to invest limited time and energy. Selectivity is a sign of maturity, not retreat. It reflects an understanding that not all opportunities are worth the cost. The economic consequences continue to unfold quietly. Reduced participation compounds over time. Fewer contributors mean greater strain on those who remain engaged. That strain often leads to further disengagement, creating a cycle. This is not collapse through crisis, but through gradual erosion. What complicates intervention is that there is no single leader, organization, or ideology to address. This is a distributed response to shared conditions. Distributed responses are resilient. They do not collapse when challenged. They adapt. Another uncomfortable reality is that many men feel they honored the social contract longer than it honored them. That perception, whether universally accurate or not, shapes behavior. People act based on perceived fairness. When fairness disappears, cooperation follows. The cultural conversation often focuses on surface behaviors rather than structural incentives. Encouraging participation without correcting imbalance treats symptoms while ignoring cause. Men who left already tested those surface solutions and found them insufficient. And there's also a loss of patience that comes with experience. Younger men may tolerate uncertainty longer, but they are learning from older peers who already paid that cost. This intergenerational transfer of caution accelerates disengagement. Silence has become a form of communication. By not responding to calls for engagement, men communicate satisfaction with distance, and silence denies systems the feedback they rely on to recalibrate. Without feedback, adaptation slows. This silence also protects peace. Engagement often invites scrutiny, judgment, and obligation. Distance preserves autonomy. Once autonomy is experienced, surrendering it feels unnecessary. The reality is that many men now view participation as a choice rather than a duty. That mental shift changes everything. Duties can be enforced, choices must be earned. What we are witnessing is not a rebellion, but a rebalancing. Men are no longer volunteering for disadvantage. They are opting for neutrality where cooperation once existed. Neutrality is difficult to oppose because it is not aggressive. As systems adjust, they may attempt to reframe disengagement as a moral failing. That framing rarely succeeds long term. Moral pressure loses power when the individual no longer seeks approval from the source applying it. Another important piece is emotional economy. Constant emotional labor without return exhausts even the most resilient individuals. By stepping away, men reduced emotional expenditure. That conservation improved mental clarity and resilience. The longer this pattern persists, the more normalized it becomes. What was once viewed as unusual now appears reasonable. Normalization solidifies trends faster than argument ever could. The challenge ahead is that reintegration would require more than restoration. It would require redesign. Old structures built on assumption cannot survive in a world where assumption no longer holds. Participation must align with benefit. Whether society adapts remains an open question. Adaptation requires humility, accountability, and patience. Those traits are difficult for large systems to sustain. What is certain is that the men who left are not waiting. They are building lives that function without permission. They are not angry, They are not protesting, they are simply absent. And absence, once normalized, becomes the most powerful statement of all. As this absence becomes more visible, a deeper question begins to surface beneath the surface level debates. What happens to a society when one of its foundational assumptions quietly expires? For generations, male participation was treated as a constant rather than a variable. Work, protection, provision, and maintenance were expected defaults. When defaults change, every system built on them must either adapt or strain under the weight of outdated expectations. One reason adaptation has been slow is that many institutions still misunderstand the nature of the withdrawal. They search for a singular cause when the reality is cumulative. This was not triggered by one event or one policy. It was the result of thousands of small signals received over decades. Each signal alone was survivable. Together, they reshaped behavior. Men learned through repetition that speaking openly often carried risk, while silence carried safety. They learned that compliance was expected, but appreciation was optional. They learned that effort did not guarantee fairness. These lessons were not taught formally, they were absorbed experientially. Experience is far more persuasive than instruction. As men adjusted, they began to value predictability over potential. Predictability provides peace. Potential often hides risk. When outcomes become inconsistent, potential loses appeal. This is especially true when stakes are high and recovery is uncertain. Choosing predictable solitude over volatile engagement became a rational trade. Another overlooked aspect is how identity stabilizes once external pressure decreases. When identity is no longer contested or criticized, energy previously spent defending self worth becomes available for growth. Many men found that removing themselves from hostile or unstable environments allowed them to rediscover interests and capacities that had been dormant for years. This rediscovery often surprised even the men experiencing it. Without constant evaluation, they felt freer to experiment, to fail privately, and to learn without judgment. Growth accelerated because fear diminished. That alone reinforced the decision to remain disengaged. What makes reintegration difficult is that disengaged men no longer perceive themselves as missing out. The narrative that they are deprived does not match their lived reality. When external narratives conflict with internal experience wins. That is how belief systems solidify. There is also a misunderstanding around resilience. Many men did not collapse under pressure. They adapted by removing the source of pressure. That adaptation is often mistaken for fragility when it is actually strength expressed differently. Endurance does not always mean persistence within a system. Sometimes it means choosing a better environment. As more men reach this conclusion, collective bargaining power increases without coordination. When enough individuals independently make the same choice, the aggregate effect reshapes incentives. This is how cultural shifts occur quietly, without leadership or slogans. Public discourse often frames disengagement as antisocial, but that framing ignores the quality of interactions that preceded withdrawal. People do not avoid healthy environments, they avoid environments that drain them. Withdrawal is diagnostic, it reveals where balance failed. One of the most destabilizing realizations for institutions is that men do not require validation from those institutions to function. They require food, shelter, purpose, and peace. Everything else is negotiable. When negotiation stalls, exit becomes viable. This realization exposes how much leverage depended on social expectation rather than mutual benefit. Once expectation loses authority, leverage evaporates. Systems built on obligation struggle in environments where autonomy is achievable. Technology continues to amplify this autonomy. Access to information, skill development, and financial tools reduces reliance on centralized systems. Men can learn, earn, and connect without traditional gatekeepers. Each removed dependency strengthens independence. This independence changes risk calculations. When losing approval no longer threatens survival, social pressure weakens. Men become selective, not out of defiance, but efficiency. They invest where returns are reliable. Another important shift is emotional self sufficiency. Many men learned to regulate their emotional lives internally rather than outsourcing validation. This reduced vulnerability to manipulation. Emotional independence does not eliminate connection, it makes connection optional rather than necessary. Optional connection transforms dynamics. It replaces obligation with choice. Relationships formed under choice tend to be healthier because they are not sustained by fear of loss. This reframing alone undermines many legacy expectations. As disengagement continues, new micro-communities form organically. These are not movements, but networks. Shared values, mutual respect, and low drama define them. They are small by design and resilient by nature. Now, these networks provide support without hierarchy. They operate on reciprocity rather than demand. This horizontal structure contrasts sharply with vertical institutions that rely on authority. Horizontal systems adapt faster because feedback is immediate and personal. Institutions accustomed to compliance struggle to interact with individuals who no longer seek permission. The language of obligation fails. The language of incentive must replace it. That transition is slow and uncomfortable. Another factor reinforcing permanence is time investment. Men who have spent years building independent lives are unlikely to dismantle them casually. The cost of reversal increases with each year of stability. Path dependence sets in. Once a path provides consistent benefit, alternatives must offer significantly greater value to justify switching. Marginal improvements are insufficient. This sets a high bar for reintegration efforts. There is also an honesty that emerges when people step outside social performance. Without needing to impress or conform, men can evaluate ideas based on results rather than popularity. This pragmatic mindset further distances them from rhetoric. As rhetoric loses influence, action becomes the only persuasive force. Systems that fail to deliver tangible benefit lose relevance. This is not punishment, it is selection. Selection pressures shape behavior over time. Systems that adapt survive. Systems that resist change decline gradually. This process is slow enough to avoid alarm, but steady enough to be irreversible. One reason alarm has not yet reached critical mass is that disengagement distributes its effects unevenly. Early stages are absorbed quietly. Only later do compounding effects become obvious. By then, reversal is difficult. Men who left early benefit most. They secured stability before strain intensified. Late adopters face fewer options. This creates an incentive to exit sooner rather than later, accelerating the trend. The cultural lag exacerbates the issue. Norms adjust slower than behavior. By the time narratives shift, habits have already changed. Catching up requires more than messaging. It requires structural overhaul. Structural overhaul requires admitting past misalignment. Admission requires humility. Humility is scarce in large systems. This is why adaptation often trails necessity. What remains constant throughout the shift is that men are not organizing against society. They are reorganizing themselves. This distinction matters. Opposition invites response. Absence forces introspection. Introspection is uncomfortable. It exposes assumptions that went unchallenged. It forces accountability without an external enemy to blame. Many institutions resist this discomfort, yet discomfort is the cost of adaptation. Avoiding it only delays adjustment. Delay compounds damage. The men who disengaged already paid their adjustment cost. They simplified, they recalibrated, they accepted trade offs consciously. That acceptance brought peace. Peace is undervalued in systems optimized for productivity. Yet peace sustains long term stability better than constant stimulation. Men discovered this firsthand. Once peace becomes the baseline, chaos loses appeal. Drama feels inefficient. Conflict feels unnecessary. Stability becomes the priority. This priority shift is perhaps the most profound change of all. It redefines success, it reframes ambition, it alters life trajectories quietly. The future shaped by this shift will look calmer in some ways and more fragmented in others. Large systems may weaken, small networks may strengthen, central narratives may lose influence, personal agency may rise. Whether this future is judged positively or negatively depends on perspective. For the men living it, the judgment is already made. They chose it, and choice, once exercised freely, is difficult to surrender. As this pattern settles in, another layer becomes visible that many people overlook because it challenges long held assumptions. The assumption that men require constant external structure to remain functional was never accurate, but it was convenient. Structure was useful when it aligned with purpose. Once alignment disappeared, structure became friction. Men did not lose direction, they changed direction. One of the quiet revelations many men experienced after stepping away was how much of their stress had been normalized. Chronic pressure had been framed as responsibility. Emotional suppression had been framed as maturity. Constant obligation had been framed as virtue. When those pressures were removed, the contrast was unmistakable. What once felt normal was revealed to be unnecessary. This realization often brought a sense of clarity that is difficult to reverse. Clarity sharpens boundaries. Boundaries protect time and energy. Once boundaries are established and respected internally, violating them externally feels unacceptable. This is why appeals to duty fall flat. Duty without reciprocity feels like exploitation when seen clearly. Another important shift occurred around time perception. Men who disengaged began to experience time as something they owned rather than something owed. Hours were no longer traded automatically for approval or expectation. Time became a resource to be allocated deliberately. That alone transformed daily life. With time reclaimed came experimentation. Men tried different routines, schedules, and priorities. Some focused on health, others on learning, others on creative pursuits or small scale entrepreneurship. Not all experiments succeeded, but failure carried lower cost because it happened privately. Learning accelerated without the pressure of public judgment. This private learning environment fostered competence rather than performance. Competence builds confidence quietly. Performance seeks applause. Once men tasted competence without performance, applause lost importance. This weakened many social incentives that relied on recognition. There is also a misconception that disengaged men reject society entirely. In reality, many still contribute selectively. They help neighbors, support friends, and participate locally where trust exists. What they avoid are large, impersonal systems that demand compliance without accountability. Selective contribution replaces blanket participation. This selectivity frustrates centralized planning because it resists standardization. You cannot mandate voluntary engagement, you must attract it. Attraction requires value. Value requires alignment. Alignment requires listening. Listening has been scarce. For years, feedback from men was often dismissed as defensiveness or entitlement. Over time, dismissed feedback turns into withheld feedback. Silence replaces speech. Silence feels peaceful to the speaker and confusing to the listener. Once silence becomes the norm, reestablishing dialogue is difficult. Dialogue requires trust that speaking will not be punished. Many men no longer believe that trust exists. Without trust, silence remains the safer option. Another factor deepening disengagement is risk asymmetry. The potential downside of participation often feels larger than the potential upside. When downside includes reputational harm, financial loss, or prolonged stress, while upside is uncertain or delayed, rational actors minimize exposure. Opting out minimizes exposure. This risk calculus is reinforced by stories shared peer to peer. Men exchange experiences privately. Patterns emerge. Warnings spread quietly. These informal networks operate efficiently because they are based on lived outcomes rather than ideology. As these networks grow, they reduce reliance on mainstream narratives. Men trust people who have nothing to gain by persuading them. Trust shifts from institutions to individuals. That shift changes information flow fundamentally. When information decentralizes, control weakens. Institutions accustomed to shaping narratives lose influence. Influence cannot be reclaimed through insistence. It must be rebuilt through credibility. Credibility requires consistency. Consistency requires accountability. Accountability requires admitting mistakes. This chain is difficult to initiate at scale. Meanwhile, individuals adapt faster. Another overlooked outcome is emotional stabilization. Many men report fewer emotional spikes after disengagement. Without constant evaluation or comparison, emotional life flattens in a positive way. Calm replaces volatility, predictability replaces tension. This calm allows long term planning. When emotional energy is conserved, strategic thinking improves. Men begin to think in years rather than weeks. They build slowly, intentionally, without spectacle. Spectacle was never necessary for fulfillment. It was necessary for systems that thrived on attention. Once attention is withdrawn, spectacle fades. As attention fades, so does outrage. Outrage requires engagement. Disengaged men are difficult to provoke because provocation offers no reward. This frustrates media dynamics that rely on reaction. The absence of reaction is often misinterpreted as apathy. It is not. It is discernment. Discernment filters what deserves response. Many men decided that most noise did not qualify. This filtering improves mental health. Constant exposure to conflict and crisis inflates stress. Reducing exposure reduces anxiety. Men learn this through experience, not instruction. There's also a subtle shift in self respect. When men stop compromising core values for acceptance, self respect increases. Increased self respect makes compromise harder to justify. This reinforces independence. Compromise is only healthy when mutual. One sided compromise erodes identity. Men who recognize this withdrew rather than erode further. As withdrawal normalized, fear of judgment decreased. Once you accept that approval is optional, disapproval loses sting. This emotional insulation is liberating. Liberation is not loud, it is quiet. It does not announce itself, it simply exists. That quiet liberation spreads through example. Examples matter more than arguments. Men observe other men living simply, calmly, independently, and contentedly. They draw conclusions without being told. This observational learning accelerates change. Attempts to counter this trend with messaging often fail because messaging competes with visible reality. Reality wins. When people see peace, they want peace. Another reinforcement mechanism is sunk cost protection. Men who invested years rebuilding their lives will protect that investment. Re entering unstable systems threatens that investment. Protection motivates caution. Caution slows reintegration, even if conditions improve. Trust once broken requires sustained repair. Repair takes time. Time passes regardless. Meanwhile, younger men are forming expectations based on current conditions rather than historical norms. They do not feel the same pull toward legacy structures. Their baseline assumptions differ. This generational shift compounds disengagement. Older men model exit, younger men never enter fully. The pipeline narrows. Narrow pipelines change power dynamics. Scarcity shifts leverage. Systems accustomed to abundance struggle to adjust. Adjustment requires redesign. Redesign requires creativity. Creativity requires openness. Openness requires humility. Humility remains the bottleneck. What complicates matters further is that disengagement is not evenly distributed. Some men remain highly engaged, often bearing increased burden. This can breed resentment and further attrition. Burnout among remaining participants accelerates exit. Burnout is not solved by encouragement. It is solved by reducing load or increasing reward. Neither is easy. As attrition continues, narratives shift from denial to concern. Concern may eventually lead to reform. Reform may eventually rebuild trust. But timelines matter. Men who have already built stable lives will not wait indefinitely. Their lives move forward regardless of institutional pace. The reality is that the shift does not require universal adoption to be transformative. A critical mass is sufficient. That mass appears to have been reached in many places. Once reached, reversal becomes unlikely. Trends driven by personal benefit resist reversal because benefit reinforces behavior. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observation of incentives. Incentives shape behavior more reliably than appeals. When incentives align with disengagement, disengagement persists. For meaningful reintegration to occur, incentives must realign. Realignment must be credible. Credibility must be earned. Earning trust takes time. Time is the one resource no system can reclaim. Once lost, men understood this. They chose how to spend their time accordingly. That choice is at the heart of everything happening now. And until that choice is respected rather than resisted, the quiet absence will continue. As the quiet withdrawal continues, it forces a confrontation with another assumption that has gone largely unquestioned, the assumption that society can function indefinitely on momentum alone. Momentum carries systems forward only when participation remains steady. When participation declines, momentum fades, and the illusion of stability begins to crack. This is where many observers find themselves confused, because the surface still looks familiar while the foundation slowly shifts. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this moment is that disengagement is not driven by a desire to punish society. It is driven by a desire to protect personal equilibrium. Men did not coordinate the shift, but they arrived at similar conclusions independently. When independent conclusions align at scale, the outcome appears coordinated even though it is not. This alignment is reinforced by shared experience rather than shared ideology. Men across different backgrounds encountered similar patterns: effort without recognition, responsibility without authority, risk without protection. Over time, these patterns shape behavior more powerfully than any narrative ever could. What follows from that is a recalibration of trust. Trust is not blind faith, it is an assessment of consistency. When consistency disappears, trust erodes. Rebuilding trust requires repetition of reliable behavior, not declarations. Men who disengaged concluded that rebuilding trust was not their responsibility. They stepped away instead. Stepping away reduced exposure to uncertainty. Reduced exposure improved mental clarity. Improved clarity allowed better decision making. This sequence created a virtuous cycle for the individual, even as it created strain for systems that depended on their involvement. Another important dimension is the removal of performative roles. Many men realized how much of their daily behavior was shaped by expectation rather than necessity. Once expectations lost authority, performance felt unnecessary. Authenticity replaced compliance. Authenticity is uncomfortable for systems that rely on predictability. Predictability allows planning. Authenticity introduces variance. Variance complicates management. When enough individuals behave authentically rather than predictably, centralized control weakens. This weakening is often misinterpreted as disorder. In reality, it is decentralization. Decentralized systems are harder to manage, but often more resilient. They adapt locally rather than waiting for instruction. Men who disengaged effectively decentralized their lives. They reduced reliance on centralized validation, centralized employment structures, and centralized narratives. This decentralization increased flexibility. Flexibility is valuable in uncertain environments. When conditions change rapidly, rigid systems struggle. Individuals who maintain flexibility can adjust without crisis. Many men recognize this and optimized for adaptability rather than status. Status once compensated for instability. It offered recognition and social insulation. As recognition lost value and insulation thinned, status became less attractive. Stability replaced prestige as the primary goal. This shift altered consumption patterns. Men spent less on signaling and more on utility, less on appearance and more on durability. Consumption slowed, but satisfaction often increased. This contradicted assumptions embedded in consumer driven models. Consumer driven models rely on aspiration. Aspiration requires comparison. Comparison requires engagement. Disengaged men stopped comparing. Without comparison, aspiration softened. Without aspiration, consumption declined. Declining consumption ripples outward. Businesses adjust. Employment adjusts. Tax revenue adjusts. These adjustments take time to register because they occur gradually. Gradual change is easy to ignore until it compounds. Compounding is where concern emerges. Small declines accumulate into noticeable gaps. Yet, even as gaps appear, the instinct is often to restore old patterns rather than examine why they broke. Restoration without reform rarely succeeds. Reform requires acknowledging that incentives changed. Acknowledging incentive change requires admitting misalignment. Misalignment implies responsibility. Responsibility is uncomfortable. Another complicating factor is that disengagement has improved some men's relationships indirectly. By stepping away from high pressure environments, they became calmer, more grounded, and more selective. Interactions that remained were often healthier. This challenges the idea that disengagement produces isolation. For many, it produced filtration, fewer interactions but higher quality ones, less noise, more substance. Substance is harder to scale than noise. Systems scale noise easily. Substance requires care. This mismatch makes institutional adaptation difficult. Men also gain perspective. Distance allows reflection. Reflection reveals patterns. Patterns inform decisions. This reflective loop reinforced disengagement because it confirmed earlier conclusions. Another overlooked benefit is reduced exposure to conflict escalation. Many social environments reward escalation. Stepping away reduced exposure to escalation cycles. Peace followed. Peace is not passive, it is maintained through boundaries. Boundaries require saying no. Men learn to say no without explanation. That alone altered power dynamics. Saying no without justification challenges norms built on entitlement to explanation. When explanation is no longer offered, negotiation becomes impossible. Autonomy is asserted quietly. This quiet assertion spreads through example. Other men observe the benefits of firm boundaries. They adopt similar practices. Cultural norms shift gradually. As norms shift, institutions lag. Lag creates friction. Friction generates pressure. Pressure reveals weak points. Weak points often appear where expectations were highest and incentives lowest. These are the first areas to experience acute strain. Response often focuses on symptom management rather than structural change. Symptom management buys time, but not resolution. Time bought without reform is time lost. Men understand this intuitively because they lived through it personally. Many spent years managing symptoms of dissatisfaction before addressing root causes. When they finally addressed roots, improvement followed. This experiential learning makes them skeptical of surface solutions. Skepticism hardens into caution. Caution reduces engagement. Another element reinforcing permanence is identity shift. Men who disengaged no longer identify primarily through roles assigned by society. They identify through personal values and self defined goals. Identity, once internalized, is difficult to dislodge. Attempts to appeal to old identities fall flat because they no longer resonate. Nostalgia does not motivate when the present feels better. This creates a generational echo. Younger men witness older men prioritizing peace and autonomy. They internalize these values early. They do not experience the same attachment to legacy roles. Early adoption accelerates change. When disengagement becomes a default option rather than an emergency exit, participation must compete actively. Competition requires offering value. Value must be tangible. Tangible value requires delivering results consistently. Delivery is harder than messaging. Messaging is easy. Men have learned to distinguish between the two. This distinction weakens persuasion tactics that rely on moral framing. Moral framing loses power when the audience no longer seeks moral approval from the source. Approval once functioned as currency. When men stopped needing it, currency devalued. Devalued currency cannot purchase participation. New currency must be minted. That currency would need to be respect, reciprocity, and reliability. Minting new currency requires systemic change. Systemic change is slow. Individuals move faster. This speed difference widens the gap. The faster individuals adapt, the less incentive they have to wait. Waiting feels unnecessary when life functions well without engagement. Men who are content do not wait for permission to remain content. This reality frustrates attempts to create urgency. Urgency resonates with those under pressure. Disengaged men feel less pressure. Reduced pressure reduces responsiveness. Calls to action go unanswered. Silence persists. Silence is not ignorance, it is choice. Choice defines agency. Agency resists coercion. This is why heavy handed approaches fail. Pressure confirms the decision to disengage. Respect would be required to reopen dialogue. Respect must be demonstrated consistently. Consistency requires long term commitment. Commitment requires belief in change. Belief is undermined by history. History informs expectations. Men adjusted expectations downward until disengagement exceeded engagement in perceived benefit. That threshold, once crossed, is not easily uncrossed. As disengagement normalizes, even those on the margins begin to consider it. Consideration leads to experimentation. Experimentation leads to adoption. Adoption does not require ideology, it requires benefit, and benefit has been observed. That observation sustains momentum, and momentum, once redirected, rarely returns to its original path without substantial force. Force invites resistance. Resistance hardens resolve. This is why the quiet nature of disengagement is so effective. It avoids confrontation. It avoids resistance. It simply persists. Persistence reshapes reality more reliably than protest ever could. The world adjusts around absence, whether it acknowledges it or not. Adjustment without acknowledgement is inefficient. Inefficiency accumulates. Accumulation eventually demands response. What that response will be remains uncertain. What is certain is that men who have found peace will protect it, and protection of peace is one of the strongest motivators there is. As everything we have discussed comes together, the picture becomes clearer in a way that is uncomfortable but necessary. This shift was never about hostility or rejection for its own sake. It was about recalibration. Men recalibrated their relationship with effort, reward, obligation, and peace. When recalibration produced better outcomes, it became permanent. What many observers still struggle to accept is that this is not a temporary imbalance waiting to be corrected by motivation or messaging. It is a structural change in how men assess participation. Assessment replaces assumption, choice replaces duty. And once those replacements occur, old expectations lose authority. The most telling indicator is not what men say, but what they do. Behavior reveals truth faster than words ever could. Men are not returning in large numbers despite increased attention, concern, or commentary. That tells us the incentives have not meaningfully changed. Concern alone does not alter outcomes. Alignment does. As time passes, the men who disengaged become less visible, not because they disappeared, but because they stopped being relevant to systems that no longer shape their lives. Visibility declines when attention is withdrawn. Withdrawal is not dramatic, it is subtle. And subtle changes often prove the most durable. And this durability is reinforced by routine. Once a new routine forms, it stabilizes identity. Identity stabilized around autonomy resists external pressure. External pressure then feels intrusive rather than motivating. Intrusion reinforces boundaries rather than dissolving them. Boundaries are the quiet architecture of peace. Men who learned to build boundaries discovered that peace requires maintenance. Maintenance requires vigilance. Vigilance makes reintegration into chaotic systems unattractive. The irony is that many of the values men adopted after disengaging were encouraged rhetorically for years: self care, mindfulness, balance, boundaries, independence. Men simply applied those values comprehensively rather than selectively. The outcome surprised those who assumed the application would remain partial. Partial application preserves systems. Comprehensive application transforms lives. Men chose transformation. Transformation changes perspective. From that perspective, many old conflicts appear unnecessary. Arguments once framed as important lose urgency. This reduces emotional reactivity. Reduced reactivity lowers engagement. Engagement declines further. This feedback loop explains why attempts to provoke reaction increasingly fail. Men are not disengaged because they are unaware. They are disengaged because they are aware. Awareness reshapes priorities. Priorities determine behavior. Behavior sustains trends. As trends solidify, late stage interventions face diminishing returns. Early adopters already adjusted. Mid stage adopters are committed. Late adopters see proof. The window for easy reversal closes quietly. This does not mean adaptation is impossible. It means adaptation must be genuine. Genuine adaptation requires listening without defensiveness. It requires accountability without conditions. It requires patience without expectation. Whether such adaptation occurs remains uncertain. Large systems struggle with humility because humility diffuses authority. Authority built on assumption does not surrender easily. Meanwhile, individuals continue to adapt regardless. They do not wait for permission to build peaceful lives. They build them where they stand. The most important takeaway is not that men left, but why they stayed gone. They stayed gone because staying brought peace. Peace is not negotiable once experienced. Peace also changes how success is defined. Success becomes sustainability rather than achievement. Sustainability favors simplicity. Simplicity favors independence. Independence does not reject cooperation, it reframes it. Cooperation becomes optional, selective, and reciprocal. That reframing changes everything. Reciprocity is the missing element in many attempts at re engagement. Without it, participation feels like extraction. Men no longer volunteer for extraction. This is why appeals to nostalgia fail. Nostalgia romanticizes effort while forgetting cost. Men remember cost clearly. Memory outperforms myth. As new generations observe these outcomes, expectations adjust early. They do not internalize obligations they never saw rewarded. They learn caution before commitment. This generational learning ensures continuity. Trends driven by observation propagate quietly. They do not require persuasion. They require only example. Example now exists in abundance. Men living calmer, simpler, more autonomous lives provide a visible alternative to constant struggle. That visibility does more than any argument ever could. The question then becomes not whether men will return, but whether society can function differently. That question remains unanswered. What is clear is that absence has consequences. Systems must adjust to reduce participation, whether they acknowledge it or not. Adjustment without acknowledgement is inefficient. Inefficiency accumulates pressure. Pressure eventually forces change. Whether that change restores balance or deepens fragmentation will depend on choices made going forward. Men who disengaged will observe those choices from a distance. They will evaluate outcomes. They will decide individually whether engagement becomes worthwhile again. Until then, they will continue doing what they have learned works: simplifying, selecting, protecting peace. This is not a crisis driven by anger. It is a correction driven by clarity. Clarity does not shout, it acts. And that action has already reshaped the landscape more than most realize. Before we end, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with this perspective or do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations shape understanding, even when consensus does not exist. And as always, like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.